I'm going to explain to you what the GNM is all about, and then I'm going to give you the 5 biological laws. So what is the GNM? Well, it actually falls loosely into the category of mind-body medicine. And for the first time in the history of medicine, there are no more hypotheses. When I was working in natural medicine in the 1980s, this was when a lot of mind-body medicine doctors, as a matter of fact, came to the forefront. We were looking at Bernie Siegel, and of course we have to mention Louise Hay in that process as well. Those were the forerunners in helping us to realize that there was more to it than a pathogen. And although in those days they still believed that diseases could be transmitted from one person to another, we didn't always understand what the cause was for those diseases. At any rate, mind-body medicine is really a loose term to cover what Dr. Hammer was discovering. In 1981, Dr. Hammer actually discovered the first biological law, and the new medicine, as it was called in those days, grew from that moment on. So, for the first time in the history of medicine, there are no more hypotheses. All of medicine, including natural medicine, is based on a hypothesis. None of these hypotheses have ever been proven. This is so significant, what Dr. Hammer has discovered, that he can verify all of his findings on 3 levels. He can verify it on the level of the psyche, on the level of the brain, and the organ. And these are biologically verifiable, biological events. So how did Dr. Hammer discover the GNM? Well, this actually began with a family tragedy in 1978. And this was a well-publicized event in Europe at the time. Dr. Hammer and his wife were practicing physicians in Italy. Dr. Hammer's mother was Italian. And although all of his schooling and his wife's schooling was in Germany, they eventually started their practice in Italy. At that particular time, his son Dirk was on a school trip with 3 private yachts that were chaperoned, of course, to the Isle of Cavallo. And it was there on the last night of their stay that Dr. Hammer's son was shot by the Italian Crown Prince Victor Emmanuel from the House of Savoy. This was such an enormous event in the life of the Hammers. Dr. Hammer, his wife, and their entire family were dramatically affected at this particular moment. Dirk did not die immediately. He had several surgeries. He was struck by bullets in the lower abdomen and in the upper thigh. He had his leg removed and countless surgeries before he died in Dr. Hammer's arms in December of that particular year. He was only a teenager. He was only 17 years old. 3 months later, Dr. Hammer discovered that he had developed a testicular cancer, and he had developed a testicular cancer, more specifically known as a teratoma. He had surgery. Dr. Hammer is and was at that time a traditional medical doctor. He is not an alternative medical doctor. He had surgery but declined chemotherapy. And when I first met him, I asked him why he declined chemotherapy. And he said to me, you know, Ilsedora, I don't know any medical doctors that would subject themselves or their families to traditional treatment. So he had the surgery. He was quite ill for about 6 months because he developed some severe peritonitis symptoms, and also his life hung in the balance for a period of time. He recovered, as you know, and is still with us now. He is 81 years old. He will be 82 this year. And it was after this particular event that Dr. Hammer and his wife began to question whether or not this event in their life was responsible for the onset of his testicular teratoma. So in 1981, Dr. Hammer actually got a position at the University of Munich at an oncology clinic that was affiliated with them. This oncology clinic actually specialized in reproductive cancers. So Dr. Hammer took this opportunity. He had 200 patients in his care. So Dr. Hammer took this opportunity to question his patients whether or not they also had a traumatic event in their lives preceding the onset of their cancer. And he found in every case that yes, there was something in their life that they did not expect to happen. And what was more astounding was that all ovarian cancers, all testicular cancers, all had the same kind of conflict that was responsible for its onset. This was an extraordinary revelation for a traditional medical doctor. And it was in 1981 that the iron rule of cancer was born. This was the biggest, single most discovery in the history of medicine. And this was able to lay the foundations for the next 4 biological laws that Dr. Hammer discovered. By 1987, he had those 4 biological laws. And in 1995, he disclosed there was a 5th biological law. These 5 biological laws are the iron rule of cancer, the law of the 2-phase development of a disease, the ontogenetic system of tumors and cancer equivalent diseases, the ontogenetic system of microbes, and the 5th biological law, the quintessence. And that means that there is a specific biological purpose to disease, or what we call disease. These are, in fact, meaningful, special biological programs of nature. Now, beginning with the iron rule of cancer, this states that no illness outside of poisoning can occur without a shock or an unanticipated event. We call this a DHS in the German New Medicine. As you know, the German New Medicine also involves new terminology, and I will explain that as I go along through this presentation. DHS actually defines the moment of this unanticipated event, and Dr. Hammer, in honor of his son, has called this event Dirk-Hammer syndrome. So this means that the event is highly acute, dramatic, unanticipated, and isolating. This experience simultaneously affects us on the level of the psyche, the brain, and the organ. In one fell swoop, these 3 levels are affected. And this is what most people say they experience when they have that kind of an unanticipated event. It's like an electric bolt going through them, like a bolt of lightning had struck them. I've had my share of DHSs, and I can verify that this is a moment that no one really forgets. However, we must also appreciate that from the moment we are born, we are also subject to these moments of unanticipation, and they can actually set you up for the future shocks or DHSs that can develop into a disease. So in a split second, a target ring appears on the brain and simultaneously on the organ. And this is exactly what we mean by a target ring. If you take a look at this particular picture, you'll see a drop going into a body of water. And this is exactly what happens on the level of the brain. It's like that drop entering a body of water. And the energy created by that event creates a target ring appearance on the level of the brain. So that means that the brain actually mediates this event between the psyche and the organ. And the moment of the DHS, a target ring appears on the specific brain relay and the specific connected organ. What's more important is that the conflict content and how we perceive that conflict at that particular moment will determine the brain location and whether or not we will develop a cancer or what we know as a cancer equivalent process. And in this case, we are talking about functional disturbances. And this is what we see on the brain. Here we have a CAT scan image known as a computerized tomography. And when we have a DHS or a shock or unanticipated event, this is what it looks like on an area of the brain that is specific to the nature of the conflict. This is quite dramatic. Of course, we don't always see this, but this I will talk about a little bit more as I go along. But this was so dramatic that it was acutely visible on a CAT scan of the brain. And this was taken within 48 hours after this person experienced this DHS. Now, the computerized tomography, known commonly as a CT or CAT scan, will actually show us practically our entire medical history. If we look at it very closely, we will see conflicts in activity, we will see conflicts in resolution. As a matter of fact, my very first experience with the CT was with a protege of Dr. Hammer's. And when I gave him my CAT scan to look at, he was visiting Toronto. When I gave him my CAT scan to look at, he was able to tell me exactly what I had suffered from pretty much all my life, just based on what he had seen on the CT. He was also able to verify that I had a lump in my left breast and that I had a significant melanoma on my back. And at that very moment, of course, being a GNM practitioner, or a new medicine practitioner as it was in 1994, he looked at me with concern, thinking, oh my gosh, I've probably given her a shock. But all I could do was smile because this verified Dr. Haller's work for me. And of course, I already realized that those conflicts had been well resolved and that I was not in any kind of danger. So this was a life-changing moment for me. This verification just by having this German new medicine doctor tell me what had happened to me throughout my life. It was extraordinary. Now, with the help of a CT scan, we can also determine if the conflict is active or if it is in fact resolved. This is so unusual in the history of medicine to have this perspective on the disease process, that something will affect the body during the conflict active phase and something will stop affecting the body when the conflict is resolved. However, there is another side to that coin that I will explain shortly, and that has to do with the fact that there are some disease processes that will only occur when the conflict is resolved. So what actually happens when we have a DHS? Well, in different areas of brain, there will be a destruction of neurons, and this takes place during the actual conflict active phase. So the longer one is in conflict, of course, there is a greater destruction of these neurons. And of course, this coincides with the target ring that we see on the CAT scan. The degree of the manifestation will depend on the mass and the duration of the conflict. So that means that the longer we are in acute conflict activity, the greater the physical response will be in either the conflict active phase or when the conflict is resolved. So when we have, for example, a conflict that affects the oldest part of the brain, known as the pons of the brainstem, then we could develop cancers that grow during the conflict active phase. And here we have a prime example. This is a CAT scan image of the liver. Now, when you take a look at these particular areas that have the pointer in red, you will see that there is a very clear target ring on the body of the liver. This is called the liver parenchyma. This is not the bile ducts, this is the body of the liver itself. And here we see 4 clearly defined areas that have target rings. And this is precisely what happens on the organic level the moment that we have a shock. So at that DHS, the psyche is affected, the brain is affected, and simultaneously the organ is affected. And we can see these target rings on both the brain and on the physical body. And these 4 areas is precisely where this particular person will develop a cancer process or a liver nodule known as a liver cancer or adenocarcinoma. But what is extraordinary is that as soon as this person resolves the conflict, that means that this process stops growing. Now, there has been a lot of controversy, as you can imagine, with Dr. Hammer's work, especially with the fact that he has developed using CAT scans to understand what process is going on in the physical body. And here Dr. Hammer has had to go to Siemens, which is a manufacturer of the CT device, also MRIs. But he went to Siemens in the early 1980s to verify that what he was seeing was not what traditional medicine called an artifact. In other words, a glitch in the machinery. These artifacts or target rings had also been identified literally from the beginning of the development and the use of the CAT scan device. However, it wasn't until Dr. Hammer understood the first biological law that he was able to understand that this was something that was happening to the person, that he was identifying an event that the person experienced. Now, there is a difference between a true artifact and what Dr. Hammer sees. A true artifact is a single ring, and it disappears with any shift in the imaging. Now, a target ring is visible with shifts. It is multiple rings, not a single ring. And when you look at different imaging or different layers on the actual CT, for example, if you look at a sagittal view or a coronal view, then you will see these target rings also in the same location. That means that this experience or this activity on the brain is actually a sphere of activity. This is not something that we just identify on one particular image. It is identified on several images or many more images. So Siemens and their radiologists were able to confirm. They did experiments. They were able to confirm that what Dr. Hammer saw was not an artifact. So he has all the papers. You can see them on my main website, newmedicine.ca, where we have all the verifications of the new medicine. And we continue in the GNM to use CAT scans as a tool to help us to identify the problem areas. Now here we have that image again, and this is the conflict active phase. If you take a close look at where I have positioned these arrows, you'll see that this is a very, very significant target ring. The center of the target ring is the one underneath the arrow, the lowest arrow. The upper area that I have identified with the arrow is the outside of that target ring. And this particular target ring actually encompasses the sensory cortex as well as the motor cortex. And they take place primarily on the right side of the brain. Now, when we look at this particular area of the brain and these locations, any neurologist would be able to tell you that anything going on in these locations would affect the left side of the body. As a matter of fact, this gentleman became paralyzed. Not just paralyzed, but he also developed numbness. So that means that 2 areas of the brain were simultaneously affected with one massive conflict. What he experienced would be designated as an MS. Now, the paralysis, of course, is an MS. This is the inability to move a limb or a part of the body. He was unable to move his left leg and his left arm, and simultaneously he had a loss of feeling. Now, in the GNM, what Dr. Hammer discovered was that the loss of feeling has nothing to do with the motor cortex or the ability to move. Therefore, it is a different kind of conflict. So when this conflict was experienced by this gentleman, that meant that there were two definite nuances that he experienced. First, the motor conflict designated that he would be paralyzed. As a matter of fact, he said when he had the DHS that he felt rooted into the ground, and at the same time he experienced a big separation from his wife. So the separation aspect, of course, has to do with the numbness, the loss of feeling. So simultaneously, this DHS was designated to go to both the motor and the sensory cortex of the brain in order to give him those specific symptoms. Now, granted, these areas of the brain are right next to each other. However, the DHS needed to have this magnitude in order to affect both those areas as well. So here you can see the clearly defined rings in the brain. These are the rings of the conflict activity. And this was taken within 48 hours of this gentleman having the shock. He was fortunate to know Dr. Hammer at that time, had a CAT scan done. Of course, with his symptoms, it was justified immediately because they could also be experiencing a stroke. But instead, they found this giant target ring. Now, it took 2 weeks for him to reconcile with his wife. And again, another 48 hours after this reconciliation, this gentleman had another CT taken. And with this particular CAT scan, you can see with the upper arrow on the left side, you'll see that the outside ring is beginning to fade. Now the inner ring is beginning to break up as well. And the innermost area of that target ring, you can see there are tiny spokes like a bicycle spoke that is beginning to break up the activity in the center. So within 48 hours, well, literally immediately, we can see the changes on the brain. But within 48 hours, these changes become more significant. And as they go along, we can follow the healing phase to the point where this target ring is only just a scar. Now, being a functional disturbance, in this particular case, his function was restored. The loss of feeling reversed, and he began to get pins and needles in the affected areas of the body, and he regained his mobility. Now, this happens over time, but nonetheless, he is in what we call the resolution phase of the conflict, and this is when the symptoms will begin to change. Now, the second biological law is just as significant as the first biological law. As a matter of fact, I feel that it's almost more important than the first biological law. Once we understand this, we understand exactly what the patient is going through in any given disease process. So Dr. Hammer has discovered that every disease has two phases, and this depends on whether or not the conflict has been resolved or whether or not the conflict is still active. Now, and this is how it all begins. We have the DHS. That is a life-changing moment for everyone. This is when we experience the onset of what we call the cold phase. So this is the first phase that is initiated by the DHS, which is Dirk-Hammer syndrome. Without this, no disease process outside of poisoning can be created or experienced. Now, as soon as we have that DHS, we are catapulted into the sympathicotonia. Now, again, we have a new term, but sympathicotonia really means that we are in the stress phase. This means that the sympathetic nervous system has been affected at that particular moment. So when we are catapulted into this stress phase, we remain there until we solve the conflict. Now, the brain does have the ability to diminish the acuteness of this conflict activity over time. However, a disease process may not begin in some cases unless we resolve the conflict. So we can remain in a conflict active phase all our lives without ever becoming sick. Now, the conflict active phase does have a very specific set of symptoms, and I'm sure that most of us will recognize this when we look at it. First, when we have the DHS and we enter into this sympathicatonia or the conflict active phase, we are constantly thinking about the conflict. We think about this conflict day and night. There is a simultaneous target ring display on the brain and simultaneously on the organ. Physically, we will have cold extremities. Our blood pressure will be elevated. Our appetite may not be as normal as it should be. As a matter of fact, some people begin to lose weight, and in some cases, this weight loss can be dramatic. And of course, there will be a hyperactivity that we will be experiencing to try to resolve the conflict. Then, of course, we will wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning. And this is very, very meaningful that we wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning. This is to give us more waking hours to solve the conflict. 3 a.m. is when we go from the nighttime phase to the daytime phase. So it's the onset of dawn. And as soon as dawn begins, this is when we will wake. And this is when we will begin to think more about the conflict. Of course, for most people, this isn't enough sleep. So we may lay awake until around 7 o'clock in the morning and then out of exhaustion fall asleep again. However, if you can find a solution to the conflict, then you will stop waking up at 3 a.m. So what actually happens during the conflict active phase? Well, we recognize this as the cold phase. That means, again, we will have chills, our extremities will be cold. And of course, along with the obvious symptoms of the stress phase, there is also an elevation of blood parameters. And here we're talking specifically about the stress hormones. As a matter of fact, our thyroxine will elevate, as will the ACTH, cortisols, and adrenaline. They will all elevate. And this will be visible in a blood test. So what diseases develop during the conflict active phase? Well, there are some cancers that will develop, known as adenocarcinomas. And these, of course, are all directed by the oldest part of the brain. And of course, there could be functional disturbances such as diabetes, or I've already mentioned MS. There could be some visual disturbances. There could be a sensory loss, in other words, a numbness that we might experience. And these are directed by the newer addition to the brain, the cerebrum, the sensory and the motor cortex. Of course, these are during the conflict active phase, but when we resolve the conflict, that switch is turned off on the brain and simultaneously on the organ. So the resolution phase will give us a different set of symptoms. So when the conflict resolves, you enter into the first half of the second phase, known as the vagotonia. Again, a new term. Vagotonia means that the parasympathetic nervous system is affected at that particular moment. Now, we know this in the GNM as post-conflicto-lysis phase A. So for short, we say PCL phase A. And if you take a look at this particular dip, we enter into in PCL phase A, it's the direct opposite to what we experience during the stress phase or the sympathicatonia. So what happens when we enter into that first half of the resolution or healing phase? Well, we stop thinking about the conflict. we experience a sense of relief. The target ring on display on the brain will begin to change. And simultaneously, again, there are changes on the organ. Our extremities will be warm. Our blood pressure will decrease. Appetite returns, and in many cases, people will begin to gain weight again. Of course, along with this vagotonia or healing phase, there will be fatigue or tiredness. And this is a message to our body that we are supposed to rest and digest and recover from the stress phase, which is fight or flight. Now, in this case, we have a different set of sleeping disturbances. We don't wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, but we do have trouble getting to sleep until 3 o'clock in the morning. And this brings me to a common topic known as sleep disorders. Of course, a lot of people come to their health practitioner complaining that they either can't get to sleep, looking for a remedy, or that they go to sleep, but like clockwork, they wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and they can't get to sleep until later on in the morning, and or stay awake and remain exhausted for the rest of the day. Well, there is a reason for this, as you know now. So waking up at 3 a.m. Means that you are in a conflict active phase. Now, again, other people will have trouble getting to sleep before 3 a.m., and that's an indicator that they are in a resolution or a healing phase. However, we also have a condition known as insomnia. And that means that when there is insomnia, we have a healing phase and a simultaneous conflict active phase running. As I mentioned earlier on in this presentation, this is a possibility. We have all kinds of phases going on at any given moment of the day. No one is unconflicted. And of course, our biological programs are running all the time. Some of them are in active phase, some of them are in healing phase. Some of them have just been reactivated by a track. Others are at the healing crisis. So any given day, given what we are experiencing on the mental level or the emotional level, that will determine precisely our sleep disturbance or our sleeping pattern. Now, when we go into this first half of the healing phase, known as PCL phase A, we will develop most of our symptoms. So whenever anyone has certain symptoms, then we know they are in a healing phase. These are known as the hot phase, and we will have hot phase symptoms. These hot and cold phases are already recognized in traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine. Even Western medicine has started to identify certain diseases as cold or hot. Now, compulsive thinking about the conflict will stop as soon as we enter into this first half of the healing phase. This is the onset of the vagotonia, and that means that our peripheral blood vessels will expand again. Before, during the conflict active phase, they were contracted. Therefore, now we will have warm hands and feet. The blood pressure normalizes, appetite returns, weight gain, etc. And simultaneously, there will be a certain amount of edema, which is fluid, on the affected organ and simultaneously on the level of the brain. Now, when there is extreme edema, in other words, swelling, that means that there's something else at play. Remember, I said we can have several programs running at the same time. And if we have a conflict active program, which is coming from the kidney collecting tubules, then that means that we have a water retention conflict. So any healing phase that involves edema or inflammation will be aggravated by this particular conflict activity. So what kind of diseases develop during the first half of the healing phase? Well, all inflammation, all inflammatory conditions such as arthritis, fibromyalgia. There could be some cancers that develop during this phase. All infections, or what we know as infections. colds, the flu, ear infections, all fevers, eczema, hives, and all allergies. They are all directed by the cerebrum or the new brain. Now, when we are looking at the pons of the brainstem or the oldest part of the brain, it's a different sequence of events that are experienced at that particular moment. I'll go through that when I talk about the third biological law. Now, allergies are always a good example of what we call a healing phase. So all allergic reactions, therefore, are caused by a DHS or a shock. I like to use allergies as an explanation because everyone is either an allergy sufferer or knows someone that suffers from allergies, be it an allergy that affects our sinuses or our respiratory system, or if it affects our skin. And of course, in the most extreme, we could be looking at an anaphylactic shock that can be life-threatening. These allergies can also give us digestive problems or intolerances to food. Now, we have to consider that all reactions or allergic reactions are caused by a DHS. Therefore, we have to look at the moment in time that the person had a DHS that included the allergens as part of what I call the scene of the crime, so to speak. Now consider that when we have a shock, our brains or our psyche will take in billions of bits of information at that particular moment. Of course, the most important bits of information that we take in at that moment are the ones that are going to register and supply us with these allergic responses. So let's say someone was eating an orange when they had a shock. Subsequently, depending on how they experienced that shock, each time they ate an orange, that orange would supply them with the reminder, or what we call a track in the GNM. And that reminder will be enough. It's only a moment in time. It will be enough to open up that old wound and create an allergic response. And this allergic response is dependent on how this patient perceived the DHS. So let's take, for example, someone is cutting their lawn. It's the middle of summer, and they're using an electric lawnmower. And quite accidentally, the neighbor's cat jumps in front of the lawnmower, and they accidentally injure this cat. So this is a shock. Of course, this was unintentional. It happened in a split second. So what kind of bits of information would this person's brain experience? Well, we're looking at our senses. So we are looking at our sense of smell. We're looking at a visual track as well. We're looking at the entire environment that this occurred in. So here we are looking at a potential allergic reaction to fresh mown grass, an allergic reaction to a cat, for example, because they were responsible for injuring this creature. So each time they were mowing the lawn, they would get a reaction. And of course, how they perceived this reaction, imagine they smelled the fresh cut lawn. That means that they would develop a sinus allergy. Or if this was perhaps a person's own cat that jumped in front of the lawnmower, then they would experience a separation conflict. And with a separation conflict, we will develop a skin condition known as hives. So this helps us to understand how allergies are actually created in our psyche. Now, the wonderful thing about these allergic responses is that as soon as we put the pieces of the puzzle together and we understand the context under which these allergies were developed, they disappear. In other words, the conflict has been opened up the allergic reaction is no longer there because we have identified the tract that was responsible for the reaction or the reminder. So it's a very, very efficient way of getting rid of allergies. Now, most people would just say, well, I have to stay out of that environment or take my allergy medication in the summer because I'm allergic to this pollen, that pollen, this tree, or, you know, grass. And of course, you know, people suffer for the rest of their lives. And the same goes for foods. If you were eating something when you had a shock, and we understand also that our daily lives, you know, we sit down to dinner or we have lunch with someone, an argument happens and an unpleasant experience that we didn't anticipate. So of course, the foods that you were eating are all potential tracks and triggers back into that conflict active phase. Therefore, we might develop a digestive disturbance as a result of eating perhaps a pineapple or something. It all depends on what you were eating or digesting at that moment that you had the shock. So the kind of reaction we experience is dependent on the nature of the conflict and, of course, all of the bits of information that were registered on our brain at that particular moment. Now from there, when we go into, when we finish rather, the healing phase, the first half of the healing phase, we will have to experience what is known as the epileptic or epileptoid crisis in order to return back to normatonia. If we do not return back to normatonia, then we will be left in what is called a hanging healing. That means that we will be in a chronic health condition. If it never comes to this healing crisis, as we call it in natural medicine, then we will never go back to normatonia and we will suffer from a condition the rest of our lives. However, again, if we can identify what was responsible for that particular healing phase, or the DHS that was responsible for that particular healing phase, then of course we have control over the situation and our symptoms can disappear very, very quickly, literally from moment to moment. Our symptoms can be alleviated. So the releasing of the conflict in the GNM, or the German New Medicine, if it's done efficiently, is absolutely extraordinary in getting rid of chronic conditions. Remember, they're healing phases. The conflict has been resolved. It's just that we are subject to tracks that keep this partially alive. So once we reach the EC, as we call it, this is the turning point. And from the EC, we actually go back into the second half of the healing phase. Now, what is important to know about the EC, or epileptic or epileptoid crisis, is that mentally, we will relive the conflict. Physically, we will re-experience the same symptoms we experienced at the moment of the shock. We will experience what we call the cold days. That means our peripheral circulation is affected. We will have cold extremities. We will be in the stress phase, or sympathicotonic, on all levels. As a matter of fact, we will also see in our blood parameters elevated thyroxine, elevated ACTH, cortisol, and adrenaline. In other words, our stress hormones will also be elevated at that particular moment. So there will also be, at that particular moment, an increased urinary flow, which extends into the second half of the healing phase, or post-conflictal lysis B. And there is a reason for that. That means that at the EC, that kind of cold phase or intensity is needed to press out the fluid that had built up in the first half of the healing phase. Quite extraordinary when you begin to observe nature according to what Dr. Hammer had discovered. Now, there are epileptic or epileptoid crises that can be life-threatening. This is a moment of truth, and it will depend on how acute that shock was at the moment of the DEHS. For example, a heart attack or a stroke. Those are what we call epileptoid crises. A diabetic coma. A seizure is an epileptic crisis, and these seizures can be with or without loss of consciousness. Now, simple leg cramps. A lot of people get them all the time. Twitching muscles, the chills. Remember, you're in a stress phase, or even a sneeze. These are all indicators of an epileptic or epileptoid crisis. It's just we never understood it before. Now, when we reach this epileptoid crisis, we enter into the second half of the healing phase and eventually back to normatonia. Now, when we enter into the second half of the healing phase, normally a healing phase will not take longer than 6 weeks. However, it depends a great deal on what part of our physiology was affected and how long we were in actual conflict. So we need to also make sure that we calculate or anticipate how long the patient will be in a healing phase, depending on what part of his physiology was affected. For example, a simple arthritis. It will take 6 weeks to run its course in the first half of the healing phase. And then after the epileptic or epileptoid crisis, the symptoms will begin to abate. So all in all, this could be a 3-month or 12-week process from A to Z. However, when we understand this and we realize that this healing phase is temporary, we can avoid secondary conflicts. And this is very, very important when we understand the behaviors of cancers. Now, the ontogenetic system of tumors is the third biological law. And this indicates that the nature of the shock will determine the brain location, the organ, and of course, the kind of cellular structure that is affected at that particular moment. Now, I'm not going to give you a whole lesson in embryology, but I will give it to you in a nutshell, in a way that everybody can comprehend this. Our bodies are literally made up of 3 kinds of embryonic germ layers. In other words, 3 kinds of cells. There are 4 different areas of the brain that will control these types of cells in our body. This is very important, what Dr. Hammer had discovered. Now, when we look at the 4 areas of the brain, they are the pons of the brainstem, the cerebellum, which is right next to it, and then that is considered to be the oldest part of the brain. And then the newer part of the brain includes the cerebral medulla, or the white matter, as it is more commonly called, and the cerebral cortex. And these 2 areas of the brain, the old part of the brain and the new part of the brain, behave differently from each other, as do the cells that are controlled by that particular part of the brain. So I'll just outline these 4 different areas of the brain, and I'll give you some examples of the kinds of diseases that we could develop when those particular areas of the brain are affected. So beginning with the oldest part of the brain, the pons of the brainstem, which you can see underneath this red arrow. It controls the oldest germ layer. The oldest cellular structure in mammals is called endoderm. This is the first germ layer that developed when life on the planet began. So that means that all of the cells that are endodermal in nature are controlled by this particular part of the brain. And as soon as we have a shock, depending on what part of this brainstem was affected, that will begin a growth on an organ. I've already talked about the liver. You saw that image where we saw the clear target rings on the liver. So when there is an organ that is controlled by this part of the brain, such as the liver, then that means that there will be a cellular change from that moment on. cell mitosis. That means cell multiplication during the conflict active phase. However, something extraordinary happens when we reach the resolution phase, and that means that these cells stop growing. And when these cells stop growing, that means that in the first half of the healing phase, there will be more organic changes. I'll talk about that when we talk about the fourth biological law. I don't want to jump the gun too much, but at first I want to explain the mechanism of what happens to our organs the moment that we have a DHS and go into the conflict active phase. Now, the other part of the old brain is known as the cerebellum, and the cerebellum controls the second oldest cellular structure known to man, known as the old mesodermal germ layer. Now, we also have a new mesodermal germ layer, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But the old mesodermal germ layer behaves exactly like the embryonic germ layer known as the endoderm. In other words, there will be, again, cell multiplication during the conflict active phase. And when the conflict stops and you go into the healing phase, that means that there will be a stop of the growth and cell destruction when you enter into this first half of the healing phase. So what are we looking at in the way of a disease process? Well, a melanoma, which affects the deeper layer of the skin, and the pigmentation would grow during the conflict active phase, and it would stop growing the moment the conflict is resolved. And if it is fully resolved and we have the necessary elements in our body, then it will begin to break down. Now, in stark contrast to that, the cerebral medulla is part of the newer part of the brain. Now, the cerebral medulla, or the white matter, actually controls the mesodermal germ layer. And here we have not cell growth the moment that we have a DHS. We have cell destruction or necrosis occurring during the conflict active phase. However, as soon as we enter into the resolution phase or the healing phase, then that means that the repair phase, this is really why Dr. Hammer calls this the healing phase. The repair phase will ensue, and what will happen is that whatever damage was done on the cells of that particular organ that was controlled by the white matter will begin to repair, and those damaged areas will begin to refill. Now, in some cases, this refilling process may develop into an overgrowth and be misinterpreted as a cancer. This is the danger in what traditional medicine has taken to believe in a cancer process, when in fact this is the body's healing mechanism. It is not a true cancer in that sense. Now, when we look at, for example, the organs that are controlled by or the parts of the body that are controlled by the cerebral medulla, we could be looking at the lymph, or we could be looking at the bones. So during the conflict active phase, there would be a condition known as osteolysis or osteoporosis. So there is a degeneration of the structure of the bone. However, when you resolve this conflict, then the bone will heal, it will refill. So again, this process could involve a bone cancer or a lymphoma, where the lymphoma or the onset of the lymphoma is actually part of the healing process. Now, the cerebral cortex controls the ectodermal germ layer, and this is the newest addition. This is the last germ layer to develop in our physical bodies. And again, the same thing will happen as it happened in the cerebral medulla, and that is that there will be cell destruction during the conflict active phase. Now, there can also be a loss of function because the cerebrum also contains the motor cortex and the sensory cortex, and also the centers that control our blood sugar. So we may have a blood sugar problem that results as a result of a DHS that affects this part of the brain, but it has to be specific. Or there could be an organic necrosis. For example, the bile ducts of the liver. They are covered by this ectodermal germ layer. And when you have a bile duct conflict, then what can happen is that there will be an ulceration or a degeneration of this particular cellular structure in the bile ducts. There will be no indication of this process going on. We won't be aware that this process is going on. However, when we enter into the healing phase or the resolution phase, what will happen is that the ulcerations in the bile duct will begin to heal. And in a lot of cases, there will be a swelling. And in some cases, a dramatic swelling, creating a bile duct occlusion. And in this case, we could be looking at what is called a liver cancer, but it's a different kind of liver cancer. This liver cancer is a bile duct carcinoma. So we actually have on one organ, the liver, we have two cellular structures. We have one, which is the body of the liver that is controlled by the pons of the brainstem, the old brain. And here the cells develop when the conflict is active. And then we have a different part of the liver physiology that is covered by this ectodermal germ layer, a different conflict altogether that is controlled by a different part of the brain. Not to mention that the cells behave differently. So we have the body of the liver, which will produce a tumor during the conflict active phase, and then we have the bile ducts, which will only produce what is known as a bile duct carcinoma or cancer when the conflict is resolved. So the liver is a prime example of what our bodies are really made up of, and that we can have cancers affecting one organ that will develop either during the conflict active phase, or a cancer that may develop, or what is known as a cancer that may develop when the conflict is resolved. Now, the brain controls each germ layer and how it behaves at that particular moment of the DHS. So this new concept completely overturns the hypothesis of metastasis. We have to consider that in a sequence of the spreading of cancers, as it is commonly known, if Dr. Hammer is absolutely correct, and I know he is, if Dr. Hammer is correct, that means that we have to have another DHS or shock in order for the conflict to create, or in order for the cancer to create or be created in the physical body. This is a process that we know as metastasis. So let's look at this process. It's very misunderstood by traditional medicine. And it is actually caused by another shock, usually the result of a diagnosis. Consider how you may have felt or feel when you have that kind of a shock. Given the information that we have on cancer, it's a very negative prognosis. Let's face it, very negative these days. If you have a cancer diagnosis, this is a shock in the moment of the patient's life. Of course, depending on how they perceived that cancer diagnosis, that is going to determine exactly the part of the brain that's going to be affected next. Now, we also need to understand that some of these cancer processes only occur when the conflict is resolved. So depending on how that shock developed or affected the person at the moment of that particular DHS, if it affected the newest part of the brain, then the repercussions of that shock may not be experienced for quite some time. In other words, when the patient feels safe again. However, traditional medicine sees this as a recurrence of cancers. Now, Dr. Hammer also maintains that when we are looking at the different cellular structures of these different cancer diagnoses, when a person is in this process of metastasis, we have to understand that, number one, it's a different part of the brain that has been affected. Number two, it's a different cellular structure. And Dr. Hammer went into embryology. He studied this in great depth. As a matter of fact, in his research, he has rewritten and added to embryology as it is known in traditional medicine. By understanding that the brain controls these particular parts of the body, he had managed in one fell swoop to shut down, literally, this concept of metastasis. You know, I've had many conversations with Dr. Hammer over the years, and there was one that is quite memorable when we were talking about the metastatic process, or the spreading of cancer. And he said, you know, Ilsedora, he said, if traditional medicine really did believe in the concept of metastasis, then they would have to have a blood screening process in place when people donate blood. And of course, traditional medicine has led us to believe that if we don't deal with a cancer diagnosis immediately and kill all the cells in our system, in other words, the rampant cells that had dislodged itself from a primary tumor that are swimming through the bloodstream, remember, bloodstream, or through the lymphatic system that are eventually going to attach itself to a part of the body and create another cancer process. Now, that concept is wrong for many reasons. I've already just given you one reason. But the other reason is when you begin to actually look at a cancer process, for example, let's look at a breast cancer. One of the most common cancers today in women. When we're looking at a breast cancer, let's say you have the diagnosis, you go into shock. If you experience this as a self-evaluation, then there will be activity going on in the cerebral medulla, or the white matter, that depending on the depth of that self-devaluation, in other words, there's something wrong with this part of my body, it will either affect the bones, the skeletal structure, or the lymph in that particular part of the body. The brain designates it to a specific part of the body because we understand its location. So that means that when we, for example, someone chooses to have surgery or goes through the chemotherapy or radiation process or has a mastectomy, as soon as they begin to feel safe, then something will appear in the lymph. There will be a lymph nodule that will appear underneath the arm, and it will be the arm that is exactly on the side where the patient had the breast cancer. Or if they experience this as a very deep self-devaluation conflict, then it would go to the bone, the skeletal structure, and they would develop a degeneration of the bone known as a bone cancer. If they experience this as an attack against that part of the body, then the envelope or the skin surrounding the respiratory system, the lungs, would experience this DHS, and eventually in a healing phase, they would develop a condition known as pleural effusion. This is a fluid buildup in the upper cavity. And of course, it will always go to the same side as where the person had the original problem. Now, consider that traditional medicine believes that this is random, that a cancer cell has to swim through the entire circulatory system, the vascular system, the veins, and the capillaries, and go to precisely that part of the body in order to create another cancer. That takes extraordinary intelligence. This is not random. So the mechanism has to be directed by the brain and by another shock. So it's when you really put it into perspective and you understand what Dr. Hammer has discovered, we hope that this will take the fear out of someone developing a cancer diagnosis or the fear that they will develop on a cancer diagnosis. Someone like me, who understands the 5 biological laws, would never develop a metastatic process. I have had cancers, and I've survived them, but they were not a metastatic process. So, and they weren't in close proximity to the diagnosis or even when I resolved a conflict. I do talk a great deal about my own personal experiences as a cancer patient. I don't really consider myself as a patient, more cancer sufferer, if you will, or someone that has experienced a cancer process. I talk about this in great extent in my webinar series. And once you really understand this process, we hope that the fear will be diffused on any kind of cancer diagnosis. You will be faced with dealing with something, yes, but if you approach it from the correct perspective and the correct level, you can survive this 95% according to what Dr. Hammer has discovered. And I can verify this from my own experience. You can survive a cancer 95%. It's only when someone has a horrific diagnosis of several cancers diagnosed at the same time that hope is diminished. So it's knowing the 5 biological laws that can save a person's life. And of course, this is one of the things that traditional medicine takes issue with Dr. Hammer, and why his German New Medicine discovery has been suppressed for more than 35 years. If you follow my blog on GNM online seminars, and also read more thoroughly what I have on my original website, newmedicine.ca, you'll be able to understand what Dr. Hammer has actually gone through in these 35 years. Now, what's more extraordinary is that he lost his license to practice medicine when he became vocal about his discovery. And when he actually announced his discovery, traditional medicine revoked his license to practice medicine. And they did not revoke his license because of malpractice. They revoked his license because he refused to deny his findings. This was 35 years ago, or 30 years ago, in the 5th year of his discovery. So the license revoked shouldn't last longer than 10 years. This is law in Germany. So every 10 years, Dr. Hammer has had the opportunity to get back his license. Here we are in the 30th year, and Dr. Hammer is still battling his license. So there is another decision that is pending in February that, of course, Dr. Hammer is waiting to hear whether or not it is successful or not. Now, these subsequent revocations of his license had to do with the fact, again, that Dr. Hammer would not deny his findings, and they decided that since he did discover this, that he would never practice medicine according to traditional standards. And of course, they are absolutely correct. So this is now why Dr. Hammer does not have his license. However, in the meantime, the first 2 biological laws have been verified. So Dr. Hammer is hoping that based on those, or that particular verification, that they will be considered and reinstate his license to practice medicine. So it's been a long, long battle. And Dr. Hammer told me I would be surprised that in my lifetime that would ever be reinstated. As you know, he's 81 years old. So, and it would be a great surprise to us all that even in my lifetime, that the new medicine, or the German new medicine, would be accepted by traditional medicine, because it stands everything that we know about disease or have believed about a disease process on its head. It completely changes what we know about medicine. So Dr. Hammer's scientific argument, of course, is not just the fact that we can see a target ring on the level of the brain or in the CAT scan of the brain, but also that the moment the ovum is fertilized, the moment that human life is created, these primary germ layers, in that split second, can no longer transform. In other words, once the human embryo begins to form, those 3 primary germ layers will remain. They will no longer change. As a matter of fact, Dr. Hammer states in his first book, The Summary of the New Medicine, the metastatic process, according to traditional medicine, would make it a lot easier to change a cow into a pig. We know we can't do that. So, the 4th biological law is quite extraordinary in itself. It has to do with the ontogenetic system of microbes. And again, this is quite a revelation. It completely destroys what we believe about disease caused by bacteria or microbes. Dr. Hammer discovered that microbes become affected only when the conflict has been resolved. This is quite extraordinary when you really understand this process. Now, again, we have to look at the different areas of the brain and the cellular structure to understand the microbial affinity that each of these cellular structures have. Now, going back to the oldest part of the brain, we have the pons of the brainstem that actually has an affinity for fungus or fungi and mycobacteria, such as the TB mycobacteria. And when an organ that is in a healing phase, directed by the pons of the brainstem, in other words, when we have a cancer process, let's take the liver, for example, because I've talked about it. When we have a cancer process that has stopped growing in the liver or on the liver, the body needs to have microbes in order to degrade it. In other words, make it go away, which will happen if we have those microbes in our bodies. So the TB mycobacteria are designated to that particular part of the body to begin to break down and eat away what had developed during the conflict active phase. Now that will only happen when the conflict has been resolved. Fungi can also be used to break down and to contain whatever had grown during the conflict active phase. And the TB mycobacteria, they actually spill over into the cerebellum or the old mesodermal tissue, as do bacteria. And they will be used to degrade, again, the growths that developed during the conflict active phase. Now, in stark contrast to that, we have the cerebral medulla, which will only develop tissue in the healing phase. So we still need microbes during that particular time to aid the healing process. So, for example, in the case of the bones, there could be bacteria in the restoration of the bone tissue during the healing phase. Now, viruses, this is a huge topic. I'm not going to talk a lot about it today. I'm just going to give you the basic concept that Dr. Hammer had discovered, because in my level 2, microbes, friend or foe, I talk an entire day about viruses and the fact that they don't exist. Now, I'm sure this has shocked quite a few of you just by me saying that viruses don't exist, because we know we can develop a disease process that traditional medicine identifies as having been caused by a virus. But I'll talk about that more in a moment. But either way, what we know or believe is a virus infection actually has more to do with the healing phase or an inflammatory process that is directed from the newest part of the brain, the cerebrum. Now, how does this process work? Well, microbes are not the enemy. They are, in fact, in what we call a symbiotic relationship with us. And that means that they serve a purpose. So the immune system as we know it remains intact during the conflict active phase. So really, there is no such thing as an autoimmune disease or autoimmune process. Any so-called label given to a process known as an autoimmune disease is what we call a hanging healing. This person never goes into the healing crisis and back to normatonia. So traditional medicine believes that the immune system is attacking self. And the immune system does not attack self. The immune system attacks foreign invaders. If you do your research carefully on the mechanism of the immune system, traditional medicine even contradicts itself. So the immune system remains intact during the conflict active phase, and it only steps back temporarily to allow this microbial activity to occur when the conflict has been resolved. So what is this process? Well, let's look at the TB mycobacteria. The moment that we have an actual DHS, if we have these TB mycobacteria in our system, and some of us don't have it anymore. I know I don't. So if we have these TB mycobacteria, that means that they will also, during the conflict active phase, multiply along with the development of the tumor. However, as soon as the conflict is resolved, this is when they will be set into motion, and this is when the so-called immune system will allow this process to happen. And this process is very, very meaningful biologically. It is to degrade what had developed during the conflict active phase. This is back to normatonia. But the first half of the healing phase is when this will happen. So mycobacteria, therefore, multiply during the conflict active phase. However, they remain dormant. They will remain apathogenic until that moment in time when the body is ready to utilize them. Now, in contrast to that, bacteria, which are directed primarily by the new brain, will multiply during the resolution and healing phase. They are in our bodies naturally occurring. We have streptococci, staphylococci. They are all naturally occurring in our bodies. However, it isn't until we enter into the first half of the healing phase that they will begin to multiply. As a matter of fact, they need a hot, wet, moist environment to multiply. And again, this is either to degrade or to restore tissue, such as the bone. Now, viruses, on the other hand, have never actually been proven to exist. And there was a court decision recently that confirms just that. Now, what is suspected to be a viral infection is really just an inflammatory condition. Now, where this decision was concerned, this involves the research of Dr. Stefan Lanka. He's a German biologist and virologist. Dr. Stefan Lanka, in the course of his research, came across Dr. Hammer. They do know each other. And Dr. Stefan Lanka, his research was parallel with Dr. Hammer's work in the 1980s. And when he began to understand the research methodology that was being used in the 1980s, and still is being used today, he realized that viruses were a hypothesis, that they were never ever proven to exist and were never actually photographed or isolated. Now, in about 5 years ago, Dr. Stefan Lanka has his own websites. He's well-published, and he is very vocal about microbes and how they really do work. And he was communicating with a medical student, a Dr. Barden. He's now a Dr. Barden, who was not satisfied with Dr. Lanka's explanation that viruses don't exist, even though he gave him all of the scientific evidence to refute that. And as it happened, Dr. Lanka at that particular time had a €100,000 reward out for anyone. This is how confident he is. Had a €100,000 reward out for anyone that could prove the existence of a virus. In other words, he said it's still a hypothesis. We haven't seen it. Therefore, how can it exist? And Dr. Hammer, of course, agrees with that. So this actually came to court because Dr. Barden was not satisfied with Dr. Lanka's explanation. So there were two court decisions. The first one designated that Dr. Barden was within his rights to collect the €100,000. So he was happy. But of course, that was based on the court's decision that, and this was specifically on measles, and this was really what the reward was. It was to anyone that could prove the existence of measles. The judge, the presiding judge, declared that, well, we know there is a condition such as measles, therefore you have to pay him the €100,000. Of course, Dr. Lanka was happy with that because that's not what the €100,000 was about. It was for anyone that could prove the existence of the virus responsible for measles. So, of course, there was he appealed, and there was a second court that was to decide whether or not Dr. Lanka was correct. And of course, the decision was in his favor. The court actually saw, with all of the scientific evidence that was put in front of them, that no one could prove the existence of viruses. So this changes everything quite dramatically. And I think this is also when we need to question the efficacy and usefulness of vaccinations. So here we have to be very, very careful and try to understand what it is that we are being vaccinated against or with. So anyway, I do talk a great deal about that when I do my level 2 microbes friend or foe. I had to do a lot of research to substantiate both Dr. Hammer's findings and Dr. Lanka's findings. And I have to say, it's out there. The information is out there. It's just a matter of putting it together and understanding what it is that they are trying to tell us that we see. Now, a viral infection is determined by whether the patient has certain antibodies in their blood, and that's it. They recognize a signature, and the signature is really just verification of a specific kind of healing phase in our bodies. Anyway, more about that in level 2. Now, the fifth biological law is also very important to understand, and this has to do with the fact that every physical manifestation has a biological significance or meaning. This is not a mistake of nature. This is a biological process to help us to survive. Diseases are meaningful, special biological programs of nature that develop through our evolution to resolve an unanticipated biological conflict. I'll give you a couple of small examples here just to help you to understand. Now, the endodermal cellular structure is also part of the kidney collecting tubules. This is directed by the pons of the brainstem. Now, the kidney collecting tubules are there to help us to conserve water when we know water is scarce. So the biological conflict that has to do with the kidney collecting tubules has to do with being in what we call survival mode. Now, I'd like to talk about the kidney collecting tubules because I will talk about this topic through my 4 levels of presentations. It is that important because when the kidney collecting tubules are active with conflict and we have a healing phase going on, that means that the process is going to be compromised or complicated. So we need to address this first and foremost before we address the actual healing phase that is going on in the physical body. Now, the kidney collecting tubules are there in order to conserve water for us to attain a longer survival time. For example, we have, let's say someone is put into the middle of the desert, left alone to fend for themselves. They will be in survival mode. At that particular moment, they will develop increased thirst, in other words, a dry mouth. This is what most cancer patients will develop at the moment of DHS. So that tells me that at that very moment, the kidney collecting tubules become active with conflict because their survival is threatened. Also, at that particular moment, we will begin to retain water or fluid. That means we will have minimal fluid excretion and maximum fluid retention. This is to help us to survive. So, however, the problem is that when we have maximum fluid retention plus a healing phase in the system that also involves a certain amount of fluid retention or swelling, then that fluid retention or swelling will be much, much worse. So we can alleviate a considerable amount of suffering in healing phases just by addressing that moment in time that their survival mechanism kicked in. Now, another biological program that is completely opposite to this survival mechanism has to do with the coronary arteries. And the coronary arteries are made up of the outermost germ layer, ectoderm. Now, that means that when the conflict is active, that there will be ulcerations in the coronary arteries. Eventually, when we enter into a healing phase, yes, they will repair, and this is when we will get plaque or blockage in the coronary arteries. However, during the conflict active phase, this is very significant. This is where the biological meaning lies. For example, if there are two wolves fighting for the rights to their territory, that means that at that very moment, their coronary arteries will be affected. This is a biological process in all mammals. As soon as there is a fight for the territory, the coronary arteries are affected. And here, in the case of the wolf pack, we are talking about a fight to the death. So that means that the ulcerations actually provide the physical body with an enlargement of the coronary arteries through ulcerations, and therefore designate an increased blood flow and an increase in performance capacity during that fight to the death. So, another clear biological meaning. Now, this goes for all of the tubes and canals in our physical bodies. They are pretty much all covered by this cellular structure, the squamous epithelium. So whenever we have a biological conflict affecting any of these tubes, for example, the bronchi, they are a tube covered by this squamous epithelium that will help facilitate the intake of air in a moment of stress, in a moment of fight or flight. So this cellular structure enlarges to help facilitate the intake of oxygen. So, of course, but then, we have to look at the healing phase and what will happen during the healing phase. And here we have the repair mechanism coming in. But the biological meaning is during that fight or flight moment. So, there are other things that are important to understand in the context of what Dr. Hammer has found, and that is our handedness or laterality. Here we're looking at the clapping test, and the clapping test is going to help us to understand a little bit better whether or not we are naturally inclined to be a right-hander or a left-hander. The reason that this is important is because our body sides respond to relationships. So in a right-handed person, the right side of the body will respond to partner issues. The left side of the body in a right-handed person will respond to mother and child issues. Now, why is this significant? Well, it's the opposite body side for left-handers. Left-handers are wired differently from right-handers. So it's important to figure out whether or not the person is a right-hander or a left-hander. And this should be done at the onset of a GNM consultation when we are looking at, for example, why a person developed a breast cancer on either the right or the left side. That will lead us to the relationship. But please remember that we must accurately determine whether the person is a right-hander or a left-hander. If we don't determine this correctly, then we could be way off where the conflict context is concerned. So it's not enough just to say or to ask, are you right-handed or left-handed? Because most of us are taught to use our right hand to write. So we become trained to be right-hand dominant. Now, naturally speaking and spontaneously, unless there is another issue that might be blocking that mechanism, a right-handed person will clap with the right hand on top of the left. And a left-handed person will clap with their left hand on top of the right. Now, I also see this a great deal, and that means they're doing patty cake. I usually found that when someone does this, that they are more inclined to be a left-hander than a right-hander. And given the opportunity, as they are applauding, you will see that they will naturally clap the left hand on top of the right. There are other tests that we do, but of course they're too numerous for me to talk about during this short presentation. But there are other tests that are more conclusive than just the clapping test. But this is a simple way to determine occasionally whether or not a person is right-handed or left-handed. Now, again, it is important to understand the relationship when we're looking at body sides that have developed into a physical problem. For example, a breast disease, ovaries. We have two ovaries, remember, we have two breasts, two testicles. The body sides for the striated musculature, the entire skeletal structure, left and right side, our teeth, left and right side, the lymphatic system. We have the lymph in the axilla, in the groin, in the upper part of the body that can respond to laterality, in other words, relationships. The heart itself, the heart muscle, known as the myocardium, will respond to relationships. We have a left and a right heart muscle. We can have a left or a right myocardial infarct in an epileptic crisis. The skin, our hair, our eyes, our vision, and our hearing, they all respond to relationships. So this is why determining our laterality is very, very important. It's also, for more seasoned GNM consultants, it's also very important to understand the mechanism in the motor cortex and the sensory cortex and the entire cerebral cortex and the way it behaves when we have a first, second, and third conflict. Now, the biggest question that a lot of people have is, what about the therapy in the GNM? Well, I've tried to give you a hint about what the therapy is all about. And really what we are looking at is a resolution or a releasing or identifying of the conflict. Now here we are looking at a process, especially when we are looking at chronic illnesses. We are looking at a process that is not conscious. There is a program running underneath, and it's when we allow that program to surface to the conscious mind that we have the control over the condition, or what we know as a disease. Now, when we have a GNM consultation, we have to appreciate that the patient is the absolute boss of any procedure regarding his health. So we cannot decide for them whether or not they're going to take this, that, or the other therapy as an adjunct to working out their particular conflict. The patient has to work out the best therapy for themselves. we have to allow them that sense of control in what they are doing over their disease process. And we must never forget that the patient, when they come into our office, that they have very little understanding or knowledge about Dr. Hammer's findings. They have been programmed to believe, to see serious illnesses in a certain way. And we have to get them to understand this and try to diffuse any kind of panic that is associated with their diagnosis. And the best way, the most efficacious way to do this is to help them to understand the 5 biological laws within the context of their own disease. This will do wonders in helping to diffuse their panic. And of course, one of the first things we need to do is to determine their laterality, especially if they're dealing with a process that is either on the left or the right side of the body. And of course, we have to find the shock, the moment of the DHS, and what the possible associated tracks could be that are preventing the patient from going fully through the healing phase and hopefully back to normatonia. There are some universal rules that I found to be very, very important over the last 22 years that I have been working with the GNM. And that has to do with the fact that fasting and special diets are contraindicated, especially for patients that have and still are experiencing weight loss. They may become cachexic. By cachexic, we mean emaciated, and they will lose vitality that is needed to overcome their illness. If you go to my blog and read Do or Diet, my blog is called A Day in the Life. It will explain this process and why it is so important to make sure that the patient is in a healing phase and in a secure place before they will do any kind of fasting or special diets. If they are in a conflict active phase, they will emaciate very, very quickly. And of course, this is part of the so-called therapy that we will suggest as natural medicine practitioners. And of course, this was part of my practice in the beginning. So, and we realized that not everyone benefited from this. So not everyone thrived when they should have. And this is, of course, where Dr. Hammer's research and his revelations were absolutely mind-boggling and life-changing for me. Because then we understood why we had success in some areas. In other words, healing phases, when we would give our remedies, it would just speed up the process. And why we had failures when we shouldn't have had failures. Why did some people get better and other people remain chronic? Now we know. So from the moment I understood that, there was no looking back, and I'm hoping that that will be the case for those of you that are therapists and practitioners that are also looking for a new way to deal with their clients. Now, we also need to understand how remedies work. Remedies, regardless of whether they are natural or whether they are pharmaceutical, will fall into one or two categories. They will fall into either sympathicotonia, which is equal to the stress phase, or they will fall into vagotonia, which is equal to the healing phase. So when we have stimulants, such as caffeine or steroids, meaning prednisone, or chemotherapy, then we will have our stress phase amplified. However, stimulants will also diminish the effects of the healing phase. This is why when you take an aspirin or acetaminophen or ibuprofen, which is a anti-inflammatory, they are sympathicotonic. This is why they help to reduce the pain. They are reducing the inflammation. The only way that an inflammatory process can be reduced is by inducing a false sympathicotonia, which weakens and prolongs the effects of the vagotonia. Now, on the other hand, sedatives, muscle relaxants, and alcohol, in contrast to this false sympathicotonia that is induced by stimulants, downgrades the stress phase. But it can also amplify and aggravate the symptoms we experience in the vagotonia or the healing phase. So if we have, let's say, alcohol, and we have an inflammatory condition, that inflammation will feel much worse. It's amplifying the vagotonia. So when we understand our remedies, then we also understand when they are the best administered. Now, all medicines, according to Dr. Hammer's research, first affect the brain, and only then do they affect the organ. This is especially true if they are administered intravenously. Now, the only substances that directly affect the body are hormones. Our bodies have the ability to recognize hormonal levels. And when we have hormones directly put into our system, or we ingest hormones, then such as thyroxine or estrogen or testosterone, or even cortisone, then our body recognizes that and it shuts down its own production to accommodate that. Vitamins also affect the body directly, as do minerals and enzymes. Everything else goes first via the brain, and it either amplifies conflict activity or it can diminish the effects of the healing phase. Now, the ideal hospital, Dr. Hammer did have his hospital. He had quite a lot of patients in his care for a period of time in Europe. And unfortunately, the authorities insisted on closing him down because he had way too many successes. Now, he saw immediately, as a medical doctor, a very experienced medical doctor at that particular time, that when a patient was in fear, that their condition would automatically decline. And therefore, he realized that the ideal hospital would be more along the lines of a place where the patient should be able to convalesce with proper medical support should he need it. And that's exactly what he had. It's more along the lines of a sanitarium. Meaning the patient must feel a sense of assurance and security, and above all, he must feel safe. Remember, I talked about the kidney tubule syndrome, or the kidney collecting tubules, and being in fight or flight for your survival. When a patient is in fight or flight for their survival, that means that their healing phase and whatever active phase they may be in is going to be compromised dramatically. And this could mean the difference between a person that survives one of these processes or a person that is going to decline. So again, it's about knowledge being power, or knowledge will give you the power to overcome your DHSs. So the German New Medicine in my books is definitely the medicine of the future, and I certainly hope that those of you that are attending today appreciate that and will help us to continue to bring forth the German New Medicine into the future. I thank you all for attending today.